Sometimes the smallest gift opens the door to the largest truth. The winter wind swept through the town square like an invisible river, carrying dry leaves across the frozen cobblestones. Gray clouds hung low over the rooftops, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys scattered throughout the village. It was late afternoon in December of 1945. The war had ended months earlier, but its presence still lingered in quiet ways. Empty storefronts, damaged fences waiting to be repaired, faces that seemed older than they should have been. Sergeant Michael Turner walked slowly across the square with his hands buried inside the pockets of his heavy field coat. The American soldier had spent the last several weeks helping coordinate relief efforts in the region. Every day brought a new problem: food shortages, housing concerns, families searching for missing relatives. The work never seemed to end. Yet Michael believed something simple. People needed stability before they could rebuild their lives. The square was quieter than usual that afternoon. A few villagers moved between market stalls carrying baskets and bundles of firewood. Children chased each other briefly before disappearing down a narrow side street. Near the edge of the square stood a temporary distribution table where food was being handed out to local residents. Michael had stopped there to review inventory records before returning to headquarters. That was when he noticed her. She stood alone near the end of the line, not pushing forward, not asking questions, not trying to attract attention. A young German woman wrapped in a worn wool coat that looked too thin for the weather. Light snow rested on her shoulders. Her hands remained folded quietly in front of her. Unlike many others waiting nearby, she seemed completely calm. Michael watched for a moment. There was nothing unusual about her appearance, nothing dramatic. Yet something about the way she carried herself caught his attention. Most people in the square looked tired, frustrated, impatient. She simply observed. When her turn finally arrived, the volunteer at the table apologized. The bread supply had run out. Several disappointed voices rose from the line behind her. The young woman merely nodded. No complaint, no argument. She turned and began walking away. Michael glanced at the remaining loaf resting inside a supply crate beside the table. It had been set aside for staff. Without thinking much about it, he picked it up and followed her. "Miss," he called. She stopped and turned. Snowflakes drifted between them. Michael held out the loaf. "You can have this." For a second, she seemed surprised. Then she accepted it carefully with both hands. "Thank you," she said. Her English was clear, though softened by a German accent. Michael smiled politely. "It is only bread." The young woman looked down at the loaf for a moment before raising her eyes again. There was something thoughtful in her expression, something that made him pause. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "people think they are giving bread when they are really giving hope." The words lingered in the cold air between them. Michael found himself unexpectedly unsure how to respond. She offered a small nod of gratitude and turned toward the far side of the square. For a moment, he considered returning to his work. Instead, he watched her disappear between two snow-covered buildings. And for reasons he could not explain, he could not stop thinking about what she had just said. The next morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Fresh snow covered the rooftops, softened the outlines of fences, and settled quietly along the narrow streets of the village. Smoke rose from chimneys and thin columns that drifted slowly into the cold air. Sergeant Michael Turner woke before sunrise, as he usually did, and prepared for another day of meetings, supply reports, and logistical problems. Yet as he buttoned his coat and stepped outside, he found himself thinking about the young German woman from the day before. He could still hear her words. People think they are giving bread when they are really giving hope. It was not the sort of thing he expected to hear in a food distribution line. Throughout the morning, Michael moved between storage depots, administrative offices, and aid stations. Trucks arrived carrying supplies. Clerks reviewed paperwork. Local officials discussed rebuilding projects. The routine was familiar, necessary, yet his thoughts drifted elsewhere more often than he cared to admit. Shortly after noon, he found himself crossing the town square once again. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The market area remained quiet except for a handful of merchants arranging goods beneath canvas coverings. As he passed the old fountain near the center of the square, he noticed a familiar figure standing beside a damaged notice board. The same young woman, Elena Hartmann. This time she was studying a collection of public announcements pinned beneath a layer of frost. Michael approached casually. "Looking for something?" he asked. Elena glanced over her shoulder and offered a polite smile. Not exactly. Michael stepped beside her. Most of the notices concerned housing assignments, supply schedules, and reconstruction efforts. Nothing unusual. Then what are you looking at? He asked. Elena pointed toward one particular document. It contained a list of families scheduled to receive assistance during the coming month. Michael glanced at it briefly. Everything seems normal. Elena tilted her head slightly. Does it? Her expression remained calm. Not challenging. Simply curious. Michael studied the page again. Several names. Several addresses. Standard information. He shrugged. I do not see a problem. Elena nodded as though she expected that answer. Then she pointed toward one of the addresses near the bottom. That house has been empty for months. Michael looked at the document again. Perhaps the information has not been updated. Perhaps, Elena agreed. Then she pointed toward another entry. And that family moved to another village before autumn. Michael frowned slightly. How do you know? Elena glanced toward the snow-covered street beyond the square. Because I lived here before the war ended. There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to prove anything. She was simply stating a fact. Michael found himself studying the list more carefully. Suddenly, the document seemed less certain than it had a few moments earlier. Elena folded her hands inside the pockets of her coat. Sometimes people trust paperwork more than people, she said quietly. That is when mistakes survive the longest. The observation lingered between them. Nearby, a church bell sounded the hour. A cart rolled across the square. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. Michael looked once more at the names on the notice board. Then at Elena. For the second time in 2 days, she had pointed out something he had completely overlooked. And for the second time, he found himself wondering how many other things she noticed that everyone else ignored. For the rest of that afternoon, the notice board remained in Michael Turner's thoughts. He had reviewed hundreds of reports since arriving in Germany. Lists of names, housing records, supply requests, population estimates. Most of the time, the documents proved reliable enough to guide important decisions. Yet Elena Hartmann had identified 2 mistakes in less than a minute simply by looking at a single page. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. The following day brought clear skies for the first time in nearly a week. Sunlight reflected brightly off the snow-covered rooftops, turning the village into a landscape of silver and white. Children played near the church square. Shopkeepers swept snow from doorways. For a brief moment, life seemed lighter. Michael spent most of the morning reviewing plans related to food distribution. Shortly before noon, he stopped at a small cafe that had recently reopened. The building was modest, but the coffee was hot, and the owner welcomed anyone willing to sit quietly and warm themselves. As Michael stepped inside, he immediately noticed Elena seated alone near a window. A book rested on the table beside her untouched cup of tea. She appeared completely absorbed in watching the square outside. Michael hesitated before approaching. Then he carried his coffee to her table. "May I sit?" he asked. Elena looked up and nodded. Of course. For a few moments, they simply watched people moving through the square. Snow slipped from rooftops as the midday sun climbed higher. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. The atmosphere felt calm, comfortable. Eventually, Michael returned to the subject that had occupied his thoughts since their last conversation. "About the notice board," he said. "How often do you find mistakes like that?" Elena smiled faintly. "More often than people expect." Michael leaned back in his chair. "Most records are created by people trying to help." "I know," Elena replied. "That is not the problem." Her answer surprised him. "Then what is?" Elena looked toward the window. Across the square stood an old brick house with several broken shutters. "People become attached to stories," she said quietly. "Especially stories that are simple." Michael followed her gaze. "I'm not sure I understand." Elena folded her hands around her cup. "There is a family in that house." Michael nodded. He recognized the building. "I have heard about them." Nearly everyone in the village had. The family was often mentioned during community meetings. According to local accounts, they had received more assistance than anyone else because they had suffered particularly difficult circumstances during the final years of the war. Their situation was frequently used as an example when discussing future aid. Elena remained silent for a few seconds. Then she asked a question. "And what exactly have you heard?" Michael repeated the version of events commonly accepted throughout the village. He had no reason to doubt it. Local officials repeated it. Neighbors repeated it. The records supported it. By every visible measure, it appeared true. Elena listened without interruption. She never challenged him, never argued. When he finished speaking, she simply nodded. "That is the story everyone believes," she said softly. Michael waited. Something in her tone suggested there was more. Outside, sunlight shimmered across the snow. The sounds of the village faded into the distance. Elena lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "The problem," she said, "is that almost none of it actually happened the way people think it did." The words settled heavily between them. Michael stared at her for several seconds. Not because he was offended, because he genuinely could not imagine how such a widely accepted story could be wrong. Yet something in Elena's calm certainty prevented him from dismissing her. And for the first time, he began to wonder whether the village was built upon a truth no one had ever bothered to verify. Michael Turner left the cafe that afternoon with more questions than answers. The cold air felt sharper than before as he crossed the town square. Snow reflected the fading sunlight, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Around him, villagers continued their routines without realizing that a simple conversation had unsettled something he had accepted as fact. For months, the story of the family in the brick house had been repeated so often that nobody seemed to question it anymore. Local officials referenced it. Aid workers referenced it. Neighbors repeated it in ordinary conversation. The narrative had become part of the village itself. Yet Elena Hartmann had spoken about it with a certainty that refused to leave his mind. Over the following days, Michael found himself paying closer attention whenever the family was mentioned. He heard the same version repeatedly. They had suffered more than anyone else. They had been overlooked during difficult times. Their circumstances justified the extra assistance they continued receiving. The details varied slightly depending on who was speaking, but the central message remained unchanged. Everyone seemed convinced. Everyone except Elena. 3 days later, Michael encountered her again near the edge of the village. Snow covered the fields beyond the last row of houses. A narrow dirt road disappeared into the white countryside. Elena stood beside a wooden fence watching a farmer repair a damaged gate. She seemed perfectly content standing there in silence. Michael approached. "I have been hearing the same story from everyone," he said. Elena smiled faintly. "I expected that. Then why do you believe something different?" Michael asked. Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the farmer for several moments. The sound of hammer strikes carried through the cold air. Finally, she turned toward him. "Because I was here when it happened." Michael frowned slightly. "What happened?" Elena looked toward the distant church steeple rising above the village rooftops. "The story people tell today is easier than the truth." Her voice remained calm. Not bitter, not accusatory. "The truth is complicated. Most people do not enjoy complicated stories." Michael folded his arms against the cold. "Then tell me." Elena lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. According to the version repeated throughout the village, the family had endured hardship almost entirely alone. The community had failed them. Outside assistance had eventually saved them. It was a simple narrative. Clear heroes, clear victims, clear lessons. Elena explained that reality had been very different. The family had received help from neighbors repeatedly. Food had been shared. Repairs had been made. Several local families had sacrificed their own limited resources to assist them. None of those efforts appeared in official records. None were remembered publicly anymore. Over time, the story had changed. Not through deception, not through malice, through repetition. Each retelling removed small details. Each retelling simplified events. Eventually, only the most convenient version remained. Michael listened carefully. "If that is true," he said, "why has nobody corrected it?" Elena looked almost amused by the question. "Because the current version makes everyone comfortable." The answer lingered between them. A gust of wind swept across the snowy field. Somewhere nearby, birds scattered from a tree branch. Michael thought about the reports he reviewed every day. The meetings, the official statements, the confidence people placed in accepted narratives. For the first time, he began to understand what Elena had been trying to show him. The issue was not whether people were lying. The issue was whether anyone still cared enough to look deeper. As the winter sun dipped lower toward the horizon, Elena brushed a few snowflakes from her coat. "The truth rarely disappears all at once," she said quietly. "Usually it is forgotten one small piece at a time." Michael watched her walk toward the village. And for the first time, he found himself wondering not whether she was wrong, but whether everyone else had simply stopped asking the right questions. The conversation stayed with Michael Turner long after he and Elena Hartman parted ways that afternoon. As darkness settled over the village, lanterns began glowing behind frosted windows and thin trails of smoke rose into the cold evening sky. The snow reflected the moonlight, making the narrow streets appear brighter than they should have been. Yet Michael barely noticed the scenery around him. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. If Elena was right, why had nobody challenged the accepted story? The next several days provided an answer he had not expected. The story was not protected by evidence. It was protected by convenience. Michael began hearing subtle reactions whenever he raised even the smallest questions. During a meeting with local officials, he mentioned discrepancies in several records. The room immediately grew uncomfortable. Nobody became angry. Nobody argued. Instead, people changed the subject. During another discussion, he asked whether anyone remembered the families who had helped support the household now receiving most of the aid. Several individuals exchanged brief glances before moving on to another topic. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Nobody wanted conflict. Nobody wanted blame. Most importantly, nobody wanted to reopen old memories. One afternoon, Michael visited the village archives located inside a small municipal building near the church. Dust covered many of the shelves. Old documents rested inside wooden cabinets. The caretaker greeted him politely and pointed him towards several record books from previous years. Michael spent hours turning pages. Housing assignments, community assistance logs, property assessments. None of the documents directly contradicted the story everyone believed. Yet something strange emerged. The records contained countless references to neighbors helping one another, shared food supplies, volunteer repairs, temporary housing arrangements. Individual acts of generosity appeared everywhere. The village had survived difficult years largely because ordinary people had quietly supported each other. Yet those contributions seemed absent from public memory. The more Michael read, the more he understood what Elena meant. The official story focused on a single family because it was simple. The real story involved dozens of people whose kindness had slowly disappeared from the narrative. Later that evening, Michael found Elena walking along a snowy path near the edge of town. The last traces of sunlight glowed behind distant hills. "You knew this would happen," he said as he caught up to her. Elena smiled gently. "What would happen?" "People avoid the conversation." She nodded. "Of course they do." Michael looked genuinely frustrated. "But why?" Elena stopped walking. The cold wind moved strands of hair across her face. "Because the truth changes responsibilities," she said quietly. "If people accept the full story, they must also accept that many good things were done by people who were never thanked." Michael considered that. "And that makes people uncomfortable?" "Sometimes." Elena resumed walking. "Simple stories are easy to remember. Real stories require humility." The words lingered in the fading light. Michael realized then that this was never about one family. It was never about paperwork. It was never even about historical accuracy alone. It was about recognition. About whether people chose to remember those who quietly helped others without expecting credit. Elena had noticed that truth because she had lived among those people. She remembered the details everyone else had forgotten. As they reached the edge of the village, church bells echoed softly across the snow-covered rooftops. Michael looked back toward the lights glowing in the distance. For the first time, he understood why Elena's version of events had been ignored for so long. It was not because she lacked evidence. It was because her truth demanded something harder than agreement. It demanded gratitude. And gratitude was far more difficult than repeating a comfortable story. The first clue appeared where Michael Turner least expected it. Not inside an official report. Not inside a government archive. It appeared during an ordinary conversation on an ordinary winter morning. Snow still covered the village streets, though warmer temperatures had begun softening the edges of the drifts. Water dripped from rooftops. Small streams formed beside cobblestone paths. The village felt caught between winter and spring. Michael spent much of the day visiting residents as part of a community assessment project. The purpose was simple: gather information, identify needs, review progress. Most conversations followed familiar patterns. People discussed repairs, food supplies, and plans for the future. Then, near the edge of town, he visited an elderly carpenter named Friedrich Keller. The old man lived alone in a modest house surrounded by stacks of weathered lumber. Inside, the scent of pine filled the air. Sunlight entered through dusty windows and illuminated decades of carefully crafted tools. During their conversation, Michael casually mentioned the family whose story had become so important throughout the village. Friedrich paused immediately. His hand stopped moving. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor. Then he laughed softly. Not because anything was amusing, because the memory seemed distant. "People still talk about that?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Quite often." The old carpenter shook his head. "Interesting." Michael waited. Something in the man's reaction felt significant. Eventually, Friedrich stood and crossed the room toward a shelf. He returned carrying a worn notebook. The cover showed signs of age and constant use. "Most people remember only the family," he said. "They forget everyone else." Slowly, he opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten records, deliveries, repairs, shared supplies, community projects. Michael leaned closer. Several pages contained references to assistance provided to the family over a period of years. Food deliveries, roof repairs, firewood contributions, temporary shelter arrangements. Names appeared repeatedly. Families Michael recognized from around the village. Ordinary people helping when they could. "Why is this not part of the official story?" Michael asked. Friedrich smiled sadly. "Because nobody asked us." The answer lingered in the quiet room. Later that afternoon, Michael walked back through the village carrying copies of several pages from the notebook. Snow melted beneath his boots. Church bells echoed across the rooftops. For the first time, he held something tangible. Not proof that Elena Hartmann was right. Proof that she had been seeing details everyone else ignored. The pattern continued during the following days. A retired teacher remembered collecting food for struggling neighbors. A widow recalled several families sharing resources during difficult winters. An elderly shopkeeper described community efforts that had never appeared in official records. None of these memories contradicted one another. In fact, they fit together remarkably well. Piece by piece, a fuller picture emerged. The village had survived not because one family suffered alone. It had survived because dozens of people quietly helped one another. Yet those contributions had gradually disappeared from public memory. One evening, Michael found Elena sitting near the frozen fountain in the town square. The setting sun painted the snow with soft shades of gold and silver. He handed her several copied pages from Friedrich's notebook. Elena studied them silently. Then she smiled. Not with satisfaction. Not with triumph. Simply with recognition. "You found them," she said. Michael nodded. "You already knew they existed." Elena folded the papers carefully. "I knew people existed." She looked toward the surrounding houses. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Lights glowed behind windows. "Records can disappear," she said quietly. "Stories can change. But kindness leaves traces." Michael followed her gaze across the village. For the first time, he was no longer investigating Elena's claims. He was uncovering a truth that had been waiting there all along. And the more he discovered, the harder it became to understand how so many people had forgotten it. By early spring, the village no longer looked the way it had when Michael Turner first arrived. Snow had mostly disappeared from the roads. Patches of green emerged beside stone walls and along the edges of fields. The air felt softer, warmer. People spent more time outdoors. Children returned to the square. Farmers repaired fences damaged by winter storms. Life was moving forward. Yet Michael found himself looking backward more than ever. Not because he was trapped in the past, because every new discovery seemed connected to something that had been forgotten. The notebook from Friedrich Keller had opened a door. Behind that door waited dozens of small stories. None of them dramatic. None of them famous. Yet together they formed a truth larger than the one repeated throughout the village. During the weeks that followed, Michael continued speaking with residents whenever his duties allowed. The conversations felt different now. Once people realized he was genuinely interested in listening, memories began surfacing naturally. A retired baker remembered setting aside bread for struggling neighbors during difficult months. An elderly widow recalled sharing blankets with a family whose home could not keep out the winter cold. A former schoolteacher described organizing quiet collections of clothing and supplies among local residents. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Ordinary people helping one another without expecting recognition. Michael carried a small notebook of his own now. He filled page after page with names and recollections. Not because anyone had asked him to, because he felt increasingly responsible for preserving what others had overlooked. One afternoon, he sat beneath a tree overlooking the village and reviewed his notes. The wind moved gently through the branches above him. Church bells echoed in the distance. As he turned the pages, a realization settled over him. Elena Hartmann had never been trying to defend one version of history against another. She had been protecting something much more fragile: memory itself. The thought stayed with him as he walked through the village later that day. Near the square, he spotted Elena arranging books outside a small community center that had recently reopened. Sunlight illuminated the windows behind her. For a moment, she seemed completely unaware of his approach. Michael stopped beside her. "I think I finally understand," he said. Elena looked up. "Understand what?" Michael glanced across the square. Villagers moved between shops. Children laughed near the fountain. Everyday life continued around them. "You were never trying to prove anyone wrong." Elena smiled softly. "No," Michael nodded. "You were trying to remember the people everyone forgot." For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked toward the village beyond the square. "When difficult times end," she said quietly, "people usually remember the largest events. The speeches, the decisions, the names written in reports." She paused. "But most lives are changed by smaller things." Michael immediately thought about a loaf of bread, a shared blanket, a repaired roof, a neighbor carrying firewood through the snow. Elena continued arranging the books. History survives because someone chooses to remember details. Her voice remained calm. If nobody remembers them, they disappear. Michael looked around once more. Everywhere he turned, he saw traces of those forgotten details. Families rebuilding homes, businesses reopening, children growing up in a community shaped by acts of kindness most would never know about. And suddenly he understood why Elena had spoken up in the first place. The truth mattered because people mattered. Not only the ones whose stories became famous, the quiet ones too. As the afternoon sun drifted lower across the village, Michael realized something else. The investigation he had started was no longer about verifying facts. It had become personal. Elena had changed the way he looked at every report, every story, and every person he met. And the deeper he looked, the more grateful he became that one quiet German woman had been willing to tell him what nobody else would. The change was not dramatic. There was no public confrontation, no speech delivered from the steps of the town hall, no moment when the entire village suddenly realized it had been wrong. Real change rarely happened that way. Instead, it arrived quietly, just as the truth itself had arrived. Spring settled fully over the countryside. The last traces of winter disappeared from the fields, and green returned to the hills surrounding the village. Flower boxes appeared beneath windows. Farmers worked long hours beneath clear skies. Life moved forward. Yet something subtle had begun shifting beneath the surface. It started with conversations. During community meetings, people began mentioning names that had not been spoken in years. Elderly residents shared memories that had remained silent for too long. Stories once forgotten slowly returned. Michael Turner noticed it immediately. The notebook he carried had grown thick with observations, interviews, and recollections. What began as curiosity had become something much larger. He was no longer gathering facts for a report. He was helping restore a memory. One afternoon, the community center organized a small gathering focused on local history. Nothing formal, just neighbors sharing stories over coffee and homemade bread. Michael attended out of interest. Elena Hartmann arrived quietly and took a seat near the back of the room. As usual, she attracted very little attention. The gathering began with familiar accounts. Families spoke about rebuilding homes. Shop owners described reopening businesses. Farmers discussed recovering land that had been neglected for years. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly woman stood and mentioned Friedrich Keller's name. She thanked him publicly for repairing roofs during difficult winters. Another resident remembered a baker who had quietly delivered bread to struggling families. A retired teacher spoke about neighbors who collected clothing for children. One by one, forgotten acts of kindness resurfaced. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had coordinated it. The memories simply emerged once people felt permission to remember them. Michael glanced toward Elena. She listened silently. There was no pride in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet attention. The room continued filling with stories. Some were small. Some seemed almost insignificant. Yet together they created something powerful. A fuller picture of the village. A truer picture. By the end of the afternoon, people were no longer discussing only what had happened. They were discussing who had helped, who had cared, who had quietly carried others through difficult times. As the gathering ended, several residents approached Michael. They thanked him for taking an interest in local history. Others shared additional memories they had nearly forgotten themselves. Michael accepted their gratitude politely, but he knew the truth. None of this had started with him. Later that evening, he and Elena walked through the town square beneath a sky painted with the colors of sunset. Golden light reflected from the windows of nearby buildings. The fountain at the center of the square sparkled softly in the fading light. For a while neither spoke. Finally Michael broke the silence. "They are remembering." Elena nodded. "Yes. Because of you." She smiled faintly and shook her head. No, Michael looked at her. Elena glanced toward the people moving through the square. "The memories were always there," she said. "People simply needed a reason to look for them." Michael thought about the first day they met. A loaf of bread. A brief conversation. A simple observation that refused to leave his mind. He had believed he was helping a stranger. Instead, that stranger had changed the way he understood truth, history, and human nature. As evening settled over the village, Michael realized that Elena had given him something far more valuable than information. She had taught him to look beyond the story everyone accepted and search for the people hidden inside it. And once he learned to do that, he could never see the world quite the same way again. Years later, long after his assignment in Germany had ended, Michael Turner would still remember the village. He would remember the church bells drifting across quiet streets. He would remember the snow-covered square where children laughed despite difficult circumstances. He would remember the smell of fresh bread carried through cold winter air. Most of all, he would remember a young woman standing beside a distribution table, holding a single loaf in her hands. Time moved forward as it always did. The village continued rebuilding. New families arrived. Old buildings were repaired. Children grew into adults. Seasons passed across the countryside in their endless cycle of winter, spring, summer, and autumn. The story that had once dominated local conversation gradually lost its place at the center of village life. In its place emerged something richer, something more complete. People no longer spoke only about hardship. They spoke about generosity. They remembered neighbors who had quietly carried one another through difficult years. They remembered the ordinary acts of kindness that never appeared in official reports. Elena Hartmann remained much the same as she had always been. She never sought recognition for what she had done. She never claimed credit for changing anyone's mind. She continued living her life with the same quiet dignity that had first captured Michael's attention. If someone thanked her, she smiled politely. If someone praised her insight, she changed the subject. To Elena, the truth had never been about proving herself correct. It had been about honoring people who deserved to be remembered. One spring afternoon, shortly before Michael's departure, they met one final time near the fountain in the town square. The trees were covered in fresh green leaves. Sunlight danced across the cobblestones. Market stalls filled the square with voices and movement. The village looked healthier than it had when they first met. More hopeful, more alive. Michael carried a small notebook beneath his arm. The same notebook that now contained pages of names, memories, and stories gathered over many months. He stopped beside the fountain and looked at Elena. "I have been thinking about something," he said. Elena smiled. "That does not surprise me." Michael laughed softly. "When I gave you that loaf of bread, I thought I was helping you." Elena listened quietly. "Now I think you were helping me." For a moment she seemed puzzled. Then understanding appeared in her eyes. Michael looked around the square. At the families. The merchants. The children chasing one another between the stalls. "You taught me something I should have known already," he said. "That the most important truths are often hidden inside ordinary lives." Elena glanced toward the people moving through the village. "Most people are not ordinary," she replied softly. "They are simply overlooked." The words settled gently between them. Neither felt the need to say more. Some lessons did not require long explanations. Years later, sitting on a porch thousands of miles away, Michael would tell that story to his grandchildren. They would expect a tale about military service, rebuilding efforts, or historic events. Instead, he would tell them about bread, about memory, about gratitude, and about a German woman who noticed what everyone else forgot. Whenever he finished, He always paused for a moment before speaking the lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.